President Biden arrived in Israel Wednesday for a four-day visit that includes a stop in Saudi Arabia. Israel's interim Prime Minister, Yair Lapid, held a red carpet ceremony as Biden landed in Tel Aviv, giving him what the New York Times called a rapturous welcome, calling him our brother Joseph. Meanwhile, Biden vowed to deepen Israel's ties with the U.S.
Now, as president, I'm proud to say that our relationship with the State of Israel is deeper and stronger, in my view, than it's ever been. And with this visit, we're strengthening our connections even further. We have reaffirmed the unshakable commitment of the United States to Israel's security, including partnering with Israel on the most cutting-edge defense systems in the world.
Today, President Biden met with Prime Minister Lapid about Iran's nuclear program and the war in Ukraine. The U.S. and Israel are expected to announce a joint declaration building on past calls to take military action to halt Iran's nuclear program. Biden and Lapid will also participate in the first ever, they just did, the first ever I2U2 virtual summit. I2U2 stands for India, Israel, the UAE, United States. That's along with Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Emirati President Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. On Friday, Biden will visit the occupied West Bank, meet with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. Ahead of Biden's trip, activists hung banners in Bethlehem that read, "Mr. President, this is apartheid." This is Karim Gibran with the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem.
This campaign by B'Tselem, which involves hanging banners reading, "Mr. President, this is apartheid," identifies Israel as a country of apartheid. We hold the American administration responsible for supporting the Israeli apartheid regime. The United States of America, as a democratic country, should push for an end to this system.
Biden's first visit to the Middle East as president is also aimed at normalizing relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. On Friday, Biden will fly to Saudi Arabia for talks with Saudi officials, which we'll discuss more later in the broadcast. But first, the Middle East trip comes as the Biden administration is facing pressure to scrap plans to build a U.S. embassy in Jerusalem after a Palestinian legal group revealed the proposed diplomatic compound is located on land that was illegally confiscated by Israel from Palestinians in 1948. The historical documents were made public by the Palestinian legal group Adalah ahead of Biden's trip to Israel and the occupied West Bank. For more, we're joined by Rashid Khalidi, a Palestinian-American professor who's a descendant of some of the owners of these properties. Rashid Khalidi is Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University, the author of a number of books, including his latest, The 100 Years' War on Palestine. He's joining us from near Aix-en-Provence in France. Professor Khalidi, welcome back to Democracy Now! Why don't we start there, around this issue of the proposed U.S. embassy, already very controversial, being built in Jerusalem, and the property that it is proposed to be built on?
Right. Well, as you mentioned, Adalah, the Palestinian civil rights legal group based in Haifa, has come up with a bunch of new documents which show the ownership of our family and a number of other families of this land going back before 1948. In planning to build on our property and the property of all these other families, the U.S. government is actively engaged in infringing on the property rights of the legitimate owners of this land, who are U.S. citizens. So that, in a nutshell, is what's going on. This is something that wouldn't happen anywhere else in the world if a regime illegitimately seized the property of U.S. citizens.
Could you explain how it is that this land was chosen and what the families are calling for, including your own, of course?
Right. Well, it is a plot that is empty right now. Ever since 1948, until which it was the headquarters of the British military in Palestine. It was called the Allenby Barracks in those days. And until 1948, when the British military occupied it, and in fact, even after that, Britain paid all of the owners rent. Members of my family, my uncle Ghalib, my cousin Ikram, were receiving rent from the British government for this property well into the 1950s. So this is it's a large tract. It's more than 7 acres. And there are multiple owners, including my family.
We're actually showing the deeds. Can you explain what these are and what has been the response of the United States?
Well, it's interesting. These are things that Adalah discovered in the Israeli archives. And what they are rental agreements between the Ministry of War, the British Ministry of War, and different families or different owners of different families, Palestinian families, both Muslim and Christian. And so they're proof that this was property that was owned by our family and these other families right up to 1948. And indeed, as I mentioned, I was talking to one of my cousins. She said her father was receiving rent from the British well into the 1950s. So this was our property. The British rented it from us and other families. Now, what the families are demanding is perfectly simple. We are demanding that the United States not build an embassy on our land. This is our property. It's not the property of the State of Israel to give or rent or lease to the United States. In fact, this has come up before. The Israeli government put through a plan to do this in the 1990s. And back in 1999, writing on behalf of the owners of this property, I wrote Secretary of State Albright in October 1999, in fact, providing the U.S. government with evidence of our ownership, collective ownership of this property. And we asked at that time that they, first of all, that they not do this. And we asked for a meeting, which of course we never got. But we did get a response from the State Department many months after our original letter, in which they said they understood they'd put the information on file. So our government knows that this is our property. And if they don't, they should know, because I wrote them a letter on behalf of the families back in October 1999. And we didn't send this new information. Adalah has discovered new information. We sent the information that was in our possession at that time in 1999. And the plan stopped dead at that point, whether because of our intervention or for some other reason, I really don't know.
And Professor Khalidi, now, of course, Biden is there. Do you expect the question of the U.S. Embassy to come up, the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, to come up at all?
Well, it should come up on at least two levels. By putting the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, the United States is violating resolutions of the United Nations that it voted for Jerusalem to be an international city and for nothing to be done in Jerusalem that would jeopardize the final status of that city. So the United States is violating its own policies by building an embassy anywhere in Jerusalem. Moreover, they are infringing on the property rights of U.S. citizens in so doing. And so our demand is that they not do this, first of all. And we're obviously, Adalah will be going forward on behalf of the various families to try and make Israel obey its own laws, which say that if owners of so-called absentee property, that's basically stolen property. Let's use the correct term. The legal term in Israel is absentee property. There are members of my family living, a kilometer away. So how are they absentees? But in any case, for the Israeli government to obey its own laws and for the custodian of absentee property, so-called, to return this property to its rightful owners. I don't expect that to happen, but I hope that during this visit, the president will be confronted, hopefully by a journalist or someone else, with the fact that the U.S. is about to build on land that belongs to U.S. citizens, among others.
Professor Khalidi, Biden is expected to meet Palestinians tomorrow, possibly just Mahmoud Abbas, but he's expected not to revive peace discussions as previous presidents have done. Could you elaborate on that? What do we know of what's likely to be the focus of discussions tomorrow, Friday?
Well, I think that what the president is supposed to do, according to the news reports I've seen, is to throw a few charity bones to the Palestinians. This is an administration whose policy supposedly includes security and freedom for both Israelis and Palestinians. In fact, that means security and freedom for Israel, but not for Palestinians. By not engaging in dismantling the structures of discrimination and oppression, which someone rightly called apartheid, that Israel maintains, the United States is in fact supporting those structures. So by not launching a peace process, the United States is supporting a discriminatory, racist regime, which gives the Israelis rights to go to the beach anytime they want, but West Bank residents have to get permission from Israel. So Palestinians in their own country are arrested. My brother's son-in-law was arrested the other day, simply for trying to go to the beach in his own country. Why? He didn't have a permit from Israel. That's the kind of racism, that's the kind of discrimination which the president, by not opening up all of these political issues, is in fact supporting with our tax dollars, with American diplomatic support, with American weapons. So I would hope that those issues are broached with the president. Those are the really important issues. Equality for Palestinians and Israelis, equality of security, equality in terms of freedom and rights. And that's what we don't have right now. We have a system of systemic, legalized inequality, racist, discriminatory system.
So I wanted to ask you about Shireen Abu Akleh and all the latest developments. So many news organizations, from the New York Times to CNN to Al Jazeera, have investigated the killing, saying it was Israeli military that killed the famous Palestinian-American journalist who appears on Al Jazeera. Now, President Biden is visiting the Palestinian territories and meeting President Mahmoud Abbas on Friday. Professor Khalidi, we last spoke to you after Shireen Abu Akleh was shot dead during that Israeli army raid in the Jenin refugee camp in May. Ahead of Biden's trip to Israel, the family of Shireen Abu Akleh demanded Biden call out Israel over her killing. And in a letter to Biden, the family wrote, "Your administration's actions can only be seen as an attempt to erase the extrajudicial killing of Shireen and further entrench the systemic impunity enjoyed by Israeli forces and officials for unlawfully killing Palestinians," unquote. Now, yesterday, on Wednesday, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken invited Shireen Abu Akleh's family to visit the United States. This is Shireen Abu Akleh's niece, Lina Abu Akleh, responding to the State Department's inconclusive findings after investigating the bullet that killed her.
We were expecting that such an investigation would actually hold the perpetrators accountable and would carry out a transparent investigation that is free from any political pressure. However, that was not the case. We will continue to call for justice. We will continue to call on the U.S. to carry out a transparent investigation by an independent body. In addition, we continue to call on the UN and the ICC to carry out an investigation and hold Israel accountable and put an end to this grotesque impunity that Israel continues to enjoy.
Can you, Professor Khalidi, talk about the significance of what's happening here? Biden will not be meeting with the Palestinian-American journalist's family, but Blinken has invited them to Washington.
Well, I think that Lina Abu Akleh put it quite accurately. The State Department basically carried out a whitewash rather than an investigation. No Israeli soldiers, as far as we know, were interrogated by any American investigator. The people who looked into it, the person who looked into it was an American lieutenant general in the military, not trained investigators from, say, the FBI. There was no real investigation. There was a cover-up and a whitewash in order to guarantee Israel's impunity and to make sure that there wouldn't be any waves in the president's visit to Israel, which is the key part of what he's doing over these 2 or 3 days. He'll pay a courtesy visit on the president elected 17 years ago and who has no legitimacy in Ramallah, but it's really a visit to Israel. And so this whitewash was intended, I think, to make it easier in terms of American-Israeli relations. And what we're seeing here is yet another example of what's sauce for the goose is not sauce for the gander. If an American citizen is killed or detained, if an American citizen's property is illegitimately taken, the United States government would normally do something about it. Here you have a case where a U.S. citizen was murdered, assassinated, according to every account by every investigation, the Washington Post, the New York Times, you mentioned several of them. And yet the U.S. government basically didn't do an investigation, pretended that it did, and said the issue's closed. Now, Blinken has generously offered to meet with the family. It's up to the family to respond to that. But the United States government has already taken the steps necessary to cover this up and to make sure that relations with Israel are not harmed. I think what should be demanded in every case is justice for U.S. citizens, as you would demand such justice anywhere else in the world. This is yet another American citizen killed by Israel. Rachel Corrie was murdered by an Israeli bulldozer. An aged Palestinian American died in Israeli custody when they shoved him in the mud, and he had a heart attack under detention with his hands tied behind his back in the West Bank about 9 months ago. So this is the third American citizen that we know about killed by the Israelis, about which the United States has done absolutely nothing. I don't think that if that happened in the Ukraine or if that happened somewhere else, we would see quite the same willingness to extend impunity to the government that was responsible for these actions.
Well, it's interesting. We're just about to go to Sarah Lee Whitson of Dawn to talk about this unprecedented trip, the first U.S. president to fly from Israel to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, the country where the Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been directly implicated in the killing of the Washington Post columnist Khashoggi. So you go from Shireen Abu Akleh to Khashoggi.
There's a pattern there. American citizens can be killed with impunity by regimes that the United States wants to stay on good terms with. That's what's happening in Israel, and that's what's going to happen in Saudi Arabia.
Rashid Khalidi, I want to thank you for being with us. Edward Said, professor of modern Arab studies at Columbia University, author of a number of books, including The 100 Years' War on Palestine. After Israel, Biden will head to Saudi Arabia, despite his campaign pledge to make Saudi Arabia a pariah for the state-sponsored killing of the Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. We'll go to Sarah Lee Whitson of Dawn, co-plaintiff with Khashoggi's fiancé in a lawsuit against the Saudi Arabian crown prince. Stay with us.